Hello. The title of this talk is Superperformance, Sampling, Planning, and Ecological Information. This will be presented by myself, Bradley Alicea, who did the theory and modeling you'll see here. And it also involves Ankit Grover, who did a lot of the insights into machine learning, deep learning, and Gibsonian information. We're from the Orthogonal Research and Education Laboratory. This talk can be summarized in one concept, and that is what's the relationship between the fly and the flycatcher. And so you can see here on the left there's a classic painting, Isabel Pinson's painting of the flycatcher, which has a woman trying to catch a fly in her hand. And on the right you see President Obama he was successful at swatting a fly by having very good control of his hand and paying close attention to where the fly was. So most of the time it's hard or almost impossible to catch a fly for reasons which we'll talk about in this presentation. That brings us to the difference in visual sampling rates between humans and different types of insects. And so one of the reasons why it's very hard for a human to swat a fly successfully is because we sample our visual environment at 16 hertz. And so that's 16 samples per second. And by contrast, in Drosophila, we see a range of 60 to 100 hertz. And in Glossina, which is the tsetse fly, we see a range of 85 to 205 hertz. They have more visual information to integrate and use to estimate position, estimate movement, and so forth. Now, there's a difference, of course, too, in what humans can see and what flies can see. So that difference in visual sampling is manifest in how they sample their environment. On the left, we see a fly VR arena where they do these kinds of experiments that yield the pictures on the right. And so you can see those visual scenes are different in a number of ways. If we can see the actual scene as the human sees it on top of each of these sections, and then the feature map on the bottom. So in characterizing this relationship between the fly swatter and the fly, we can use this category called superperformers. And so everything I'm going to show you on this graph is collectively known as superperformers. So if we compare the sampling rate with the planning rate, and the sampling rate would be that visual sampling rate, just as an example, and the planning rate would be some sort of internal model of the interaction and thinking about what the next move should be, we end up with three categories. The first is super samplers, and super samplers have a high sampling rate of their environment, and that would be analogous to a fly. The super planner, on the other hand, is analogous to a human because a human plans their next move when they think about capturing a fly. They don't have the advantage of sensory sampling, but they do have the advantage, in this model, of planning out their next move. And then organisms that have both at certain levels have this optimal trade-off, which we'll talk about in context. So one example from the machine learning literature is this idea of a world model. So we can say that super planners have a world model. And so this is an example from Han Schmidt-Huber from the archive. This is a race car simulation that they train their model on, get a scene reconstruction out of the network. And as you can see, at the left, there's a race car simulation in a virtual world. And on the right, you have this representation of the race car simulation in the model. And it results in this world model of everything in the simulation that it's exposed to being represented in a hyper-realistic way. So it's a compressed hyper-realistic representation of the world. And what we think is that the super planners have these kind of representations. In super samplers, we also maybe have representations. This is summarized by the snapshot model. So these are some older examples of this kind of model from the literature, a paper in the 80s and a paper in the 90s, respectively. And you can see at the graph on the lower left what this kind of representation entails. So it's a retinotopic, panoramic-based representation. It's sensitive to horizontal and vertical extents and scale changes. So you can see that you have a stream of information over time, and it tracks the retinal position and the animal position, and then those things are integrated. So even in your super samplers, where you have a very high rate of sampling, there's got to be some sort of internal representation. That internal representation is not as detailed as the world model, but nevertheless, we have this trade-off between detailed representation and detailed super inputs. And so here's our graph once again. We can talk about super samplers. We can talk about super planners. And then there's this relativistic regime. So this is where both the sampling rate and the planning rate are high. So in our optimal trade-off example, the sampling rate and planning rate are somewhat low but not accentuated. In the super planner, we have an accentuated world model. In the super sampler, we have an accentuated sampling regime where we have a high sensory sampling rate. But in the relativistic regime, this trade-off that we see with the blue line breaks down, and we get a high planning rate and a high sampling rate. We don't know if we see this in nature. We're going to talk about some scenarios in computational agents where we might be able to uncover this relativistic regime. So we can also do this using a paradigm that our group works on called metabrains. They're these layered representations with representation-free models at the bottom and representation-rich models at the top. So in the language of what we've been talking about, representation-free models and sparse representations would be those provided by the super samplers, and representation-rich models would be those provided by the super planners. And so you can actually have a super sampler module, a super planner module. They can interact. Those models interact. Information moves up and down the layers, and you can get this sort of relativistic regime out of a computational agent, or you can represent some of these. You can have one agent that's a super sampler, one that's a super planner, and pit them against one another in a competition. An example of the relativistic regime made real in technological context is the Phantom TMX 510 super slow-mo high-res camera. So this is something that takes a lot of visual samples and then has some sort of machine learning interface on board that can analyze the frames as they're captured. So this is where we have 10 to the 6th hertz full color HD images that are captured, and this is representative of this ultra acute vision. Now we have a concept in the paper called information aliasing. Panel A gives a demonstration of this. So sometimes there's a true sampling rate in the environment, and the agent has a certain sampling rate, and sometimes the agent oversamples or undersamples the information in the case of aliasing, and they're getting noise instead of information out of the sampling. So that would be like a fly with its high visual sampling rate sampling something that's a very low frequency process. So these are examples of sensory upsampling. These are visual illusions. And this is sensory downsampling, where you get pixelization of images. And then this is what happens from the human perspective, aliasing of bird wings. You see that the bird wings are flapping at the same frequency as the camera capture. And so it looks to the human eye or through the camera as if the wings are standing still, but in fact they're flapping. It's just that the visual sampling is not adequate. So this panel B demonstrates information moments. The agent samples a certain part of the information that's coming. So the information is represented by this blue sine wave, and these boxes are representative of the sampling window that the agent is using. And so it doesn't sample the entire sequence of events. It samples very small windows. At some points in the signal, we get small samples, and then we put those together. The paper describes this in more detail. So this is something we term coevolutionary superperformance. So for each agent here, the gray agent and the blue agent, they play this pursuit evasion game. And so they both have, like, one is a super sampler and one is a super planner, and they basically try to outcompete one another. So the blue agents on the right try to predict what the gray agents on the left are generating, and the gray agents on the left are trying to generate cryptic signals that the agents on the right cannot recognize. So strong super performance in the pursuer leads to strong super sampling in the evader. And conversely, weak planning in the pursuer leads to weak super sampling in the evader. So these are some examples of these pursuit evasion games. This is where we have these weak and strong cases. So sometimes we have two gray agents pursuing a blue agent. Sometimes they're pursuing each other. And sometimes we have just the strong pairwise interaction. And so this is where, when sampling strategies are asymmetric, a weak relationship between agents results. So for example, the blue agent uses strategy M2 and strategy M3. You can see they're sampling sort of the tops of the amplitudes of the sine wave, whereas the super planner in gray is using the M1 strategy, which samples a whole half of a sine wave, and so it's able to get more information about its environment. But when the sampling strategies are near isomorphic, a strong relationship between agents results. And so this is a case where the supersampler pursues strategy M2, M3, and M4, and then the relativistic agent pursues all of the strategies. The relativistic agent has an advantage, the one in blue, but it's a strong relationship because it can co-evolve more cleanly. Super planning in the machine learning, deep learning paradigm, again, it needs a world model to simulate. So we usually, in this case, in super planners, we have a large internal model size with a sufficiently high sampling rate, and it can be upscaled to match continuity in the world. Whereas super sampling in the machine learning, deep learning paradigm involves the training of data-driven models. So this would correspond with high sampling rates, but with a low level of aliasing bias. We can downsample to maintain continuity in the world. So we can upsample and downsample in these cases accordingly. And we expect to see in the medium case a hyper-realistic representation. When we have low sampling, we have a collapsed representation. And when we have high sampling, we also have a collapsed representation. And so super sampling can occur in technological systems. There are examples from NeRFs, or neural radiance fields. We have novel view synthesis and deep learning super sampling in the form of NVIDIA graphics cards. We also have aliasing in technological systems. So we see this in neural networks. So we see state aliasing in RNNs in the form of conflating two or more distinct states in the representation space. We also see temporal anti-aliasing, which is where we have spatial anti-aliasing techniques that combine past frames and current frames to remove noise in the current frame. And so finally, we can see differences between the super sampler, the super planner, and a median sampler. The super sampler has a lot of information available to it. The super planner only has a few points, but it can infer other things. And then median samplers have a medium amount of information, but also can plan to extrapolate that to other contexts. So we can think of these information spheres as being indicative of this median. So when we have a lot of information, or when we're increasing the amount of information, we're correcting suboptimal performance by upsampling the sensory volume. So we add more points to it. So if there's any sort of suboptimal performance, we add points and we can gain performance. The same thing holds true if there are too many points in the sphere and there's an overwhelming amount of information in the sphere. We can decrease the amount of information in that sphere. And then finally, if we hit optimal performance and we can characterize that, it's usually through some sort of median sampling strategy. We don't have to make any sort of interventions. This also translates into Gibsonian information. So from the BICA proceedings paper in 2021, we talked about Gibsonian information, which I won't get into here. But I will say that there's the structure of the information internal communication channel involves many parts that are amenable to this approach. We also propose an algorithm. So first of all, we initialize our agents, X emitters and Y receivers. We provide distributions for emitter sampling rates and receiver internal model sizes respectively. So our receivers have internal models, our emitters have sampling rates, and remember our emitters are in one color and the receivers are in another. And then XS, YS is the isomorphic mapping of each agent's spatial representation. So each agent has a spatial representation. They're either sampling space or restricting space. And then there's a fitness threshold that's crossed when evasion or prediction criterion are less than 0. So the ones with a good evasion or prediction criteria with an elevated ability to evade or predict survive to the next generation. If you're good at evasion, or if you're good at prediction, you survive to the next generation and you become sort of a driver of evolution here. So in an evasion pursuit scenario, R and I are related in the following manner. Increases in I drive increases in R. So when you increase the pressure on prediction, you drive the increase in evasion, whereas decreases in prediction relax pressure on but do not decrease evasion. So there's this relationship, and this is related to these weak and strong cases I showed earlier. Successful evasion is where function is less than 0. Successful evasion is basically the lag between the baseline sampling rate y and the increased sampling rate of x. And this is an example of the blue agent circled in the black circle has successfully evaded its pursuer. Thank you for your attention.